This fascinating story begins with a warning that tells us that, back in early 1995, a hiker got lost in the cold remote mountains of Central Oregon. After several sightings, some members of the isolated local community claimed that the missing man had contracted a strange animal-borne virus known as the hill fever. However, the area's ancient natives called it something else, wolf face, and that's how we meet Blake, a boy raised under the strict discipline of his father Grady, who treated him like he was raising a soldier. Every morning, Blake was woken up with rigid, precise orders. During breakfast, Grady told him they'd go hunting at 7 sharp, which made the boy rush to get his gear ready for the day in the dense forest. Before they set off on their trek, father and son paused to admire a view that never ceased to amaze them. They crossed meadows, waded through rivers, and as they explored, Blake learned which mushrooms were safe and which ones to avoid touching. However, the boy's attention wasn't always steady, leading his father to warn him sternly. They were in a forest as beautiful as it was dangerous, and survival meant staying alert at all times. Grady reminded him that death could come easily, and he wouldn't always be there to protect him. Soon they spotted a deer. Grady got ready to hunt it, but the animal vanished between the trees. When he looked back at Blake, he was horrified to find that the boy was gone. Blake, trying to get a better view, had strayed off the trail. At that moment, he spotted the figure of a large, strange being in front of him. Though the sighting was brief, the shock froze him in place, but after not seeing it again, he decided to slowly retrace his steps. Suddenly, his father appeared behind him, startling him and yelling in fury for having strayed, trying to contain his rage. Though he managed to calm down, both began to hear unsettling noises coming from the forest. They decided to take shelter in a nearby hunting cabin, where Grady told Blake to cover his ears. Outside, they could hear faint but grotesque creaks in the wooden stairs as if something heavy was climbing up. The monster couldn't open the cabin door and eventually left, leaving deep scratches in the wood. After making sure they were safe, Grady scanned the surroundings and found that the deer they had tried to hunt had been brutally devoured by some wild beast. Staying alert, he managed to fire at a part of the creature that had been stalking them. Back home, Grady chose to reassure his son, telling him they'd just faced one of the many bears in the woods. However, Blake saw him secretly contacting someone through a radio, where he confessed to having seen the wolf face. Grady was absolutely certain it was real, and that he almost shot it. He insisted he wasn't looking for trouble, that he was just hunting deer with his son, but now he was determined to catch the creature to ensure his little one's safety. 30 years later, amidst the hustle and bustle of the big city, we see Blake again, this time with his daughter. They're about to head home when the little girl accidentally stumbles into an unsettling-looking man. Blake, noticing the situation, quickly steps in to help her, though he can't help but scold her afterward. However, upon reflection, he realizes his reaction wasn't the best, and with a sigh of regret, he apologizes for getting upset, telling Ginger to be more careful next time. Later, Blake plays with his daughter until Charlotte, his wife, returns from work. She greets both of them and hands her husband an envelope containing his father Grady's will, who recently passed away. After a brief exchange, she tries to take an important call, but Blake, unaware of the call's significance, interrupts her. This triggers a sharp remark from Charlotte, revealing that their marriage carries underlying issues. Once they both calm down, Blake tells her that the letter isn't just a will, but also the official death certificate for his father. With a mix of nostalgia and sadness, he confesses that, although he knew this moment would come, he can't help but feel affected. He expresses regret for not having known his father better, a man whose relationship with him was marked by fear. He barely had the chance to distance himself before he did, and years passed without them speaking. Now that he can't, he admits he wishes he had the chance to have a conversation with him. The next day, Blake decides to bring lunch to Charlotte at work, although the tension between them is still palpable. In an attempt to reconnect, Blake asks her if she's still truly happy, confessing that he feels like they're slowly drifting apart. He explains that he came to visit her because last night he realized that both she and Ginger are the only family he has left. Even though time sometimes feels endless, every passing day makes them feel like they have less to share together. That's why he asks her to live every moment to the fullest as a family. Charlotte, although visibly moved, struggles to express what's truly stopping them from reaching that kind of fulfillment. Blake then shares his decision to go back to his father's house to sort through his belongings. He takes the opportunity to suggest that Charlotte and Ginger come along, spend the summer there, away from the hustle of the city. He talks about the valleys between the mountains he used to gaze at, a place that always brought him a sense of deep peace. Blake also proposes that she work remotely, so she can spend more time with Ginger, and in the process find inspiration for her book. Charlotte, though, reveals her doubts. She's unsure about her role as a mother. She admits she feels like she doesn't have much in common with her daughter anymore, who now seems to be spending more time with Blake. But he, with a calm voice, reassures her that she's still a wonderful mom and insists that she come with them, trusting that this experience will help them reconnect as a family. A few days later, our protagonists are driving along vast roads heading towards Oregon. Along the way, they play guessing games with Ginger, sharing pleasant moments and strengthening their family bond. At one point, Blake stops, confused about the correct road. The lack of signal on his GPS forces him to pull out a physical map, trying to get his bearings. Meanwhile, Ginger notices a man watching them from a nearby checkpoint. Charlotte, worried, suggests they leave immediately when she notices the man has a weapon, but Blake reassures her, explaining that it's common for people to carry weapons in the mountains of Oregon. When he sees the man approaching, Blake rolls down the window, ready to talk. The stranger Ginger asks where they're headed, and Blake replies that he's looking for his father's farm. He explains he hasn't been there in years and mentions who his dad was. As soon as the man hears the name, he recognizes it instantly and introduces himself as Derek, the son of an old friend of Blake's father. Surprised, Blake also recognizes him, and after a brief exchange asks how he's been. Derek mentions that many families from the area decided to move away, reminding them that the mountains can be inhospitable at night due to the lack of light and electricity. Blake explains that he's just trying to get to his dad's house, but Derek informs him that they're actually at the entrance to his own property. Derek offers to guide them so they don't have to turn back to the main road. With little time to argue, Charlotte moves to the back seat with Ginger while Derek gets in the vehicle. As they drive, Blake takes the chance to introduce his family, and together they begin their journey towards the farm. As they make their way through the dense mountain forests, they talk about life in this region, the hardships faced by its residents, and the challenges of adapting to such an isolated environment. Charlotte, ever the optimist, assures them that her family is strong enough to handle any adversity. However, Derek points out that while they may live a healthy and safe life, he doesn't see them as a truly strong family. As they near their destination, Derek takes the opportunity to ask Blake about his work. Blake tells him that he's a writer, although he's currently unemployed, and that he's dedicating all his time to caring for his daughter in the back seat. Charlotte, for her part, mentions that she works as a journalist. After hearing them, Derek comments that Blake must look at them every day and wonder how he managed to build such a beautiful family. Blake responds with a firm yes. However, at that moment, as he turns his attention back to the road, he spots something unexpected in the middle of it. He doesn't have enough time to brake, and the only option he sees is to swerve sharply. The vehicle loses control and ends up tumbling down a steep incline, taking the whole family and their new companion with it. When he wakes up after the crash, Blake immediately checks to make sure his wife and daughter are okay. The truck is now precariously hanging between the trees. Amid the chaos, Derek, in desperation, tries to open the door, but as he does, he falls hard to the ground. Blake then tells his wife and daughter to climb out through the window. Once they're both safe, he rushes to follow them. However, Blake starts to sense an unsettling presence. Something moves in the shadows of the dark forest. He barely manages to close the passenger door when suddenly a beastly creature, moving with incredible speed, smashes the window with immense force and attacks Derek mercilessly, dragging him into the depths of the forest. Disappearing into the darkness, Blake, with no time to process what's happened, leads his family to the top of the truck. He climbs down first and then helps his wife and daughter to safety. Unbeknownst to them, they are being stalked. In the rising tension, they decide to run through the dark forest. Exhausted, Ginger is carried in her father's arms. Blake insists he recognizes the path and tells them they're close to the farm. As they finally spot the building ahead, he urges them to run as fast as they can, hearing the deafening roar of the creature drawing closer. In the dark of the night, they manage to reach the house safe and sound. Just as they close the door, they hear the fierce scratching of the beast trying to get in before it finally backs off. Blake, with a flashlight in hand, walks around the house inspecting the exterior, making sure the danger has passed. He then heads down to the basement, trying to figure out how to turn on the lights. Although it seems he's broken something while fiddling with the switches, the lights of the farm eventually flicker on. Back with his family, Blake reassures them that the danger has passed and takes Ginger to her room, trying to calm her down and help her get some rest. The little one, tearful, expresses how badly she wants to go home. Blake gently explains that it's not possible just yet and that they'll have to wait until dawn. Throughout the night, Blake stays alert, keeping an eye out for any signs from the outside. Despite his efforts not to worry his daughter, Ginger wakes up and with a trembling voice begs him not to leave her alone. Moved, Blake comforts her. When she asks if the man who was with them in the truck died, he answers honestly that he doesn't know, though he fears the chances are high. With a tone full of regret, Blake apologizes to his daughter for putting her in such a terrifying situation. He confesses that he feels guilty for not protecting her the way he should have. His voice cracks as he admits that he'll never forgive himself if his little girl doesn't make it through what happened. Finally, he shares a sad reflection. When you're a parent, the fear of your children's suffering can make you make mistakes that end up hurting them even more. He reminds his daughter how much he loves her, and after managing to get a smile from her, he starts to say his goodbyes with a solemn promise. He won't let anything bad happen to her. However, while sharing this moment with her, his wife hears every word from the living room. When Blake joins Charlotte, he tells her they need to reinforce the entrances, but she, visibly shaken, can only ask what that creature that chased them was. Blake admits he doesn't know for sure. He thinks it might have been an animal, though he swears that while they were still on the road, he saw it standing up like it was a person. Despite his doubts, he spends the rest of the night reinforcing the doors, knowing that any effort would be useless if the beast really wanted to get in. Charlotte suggests they try to get help, but the lack of signals seems to trap them. In response, Blake shows her an old radio system that belonged to his father. Although they try to communicate, they don't get a response. Then a foul smell catches Blake's attention. Curious, he follows the scent and discovers a refrigerator filled with dried meat, likely left by Grady. When he eats a piece, he hurts his jaw, and to his horror, he ends up spitting out a whole tooth. As his face begins to swell, Charlotte tries to help him. That's when she notices a wound on his arm that she quickly disinfects and bandages. Blake thinks he might have cut himself on the truck's glass during the attack, but Charlotte isn't so sure. Though the process is painful, he's grateful for her help and asks her to try contacting someone again on the radio. As the minutes tick by, the pressure of protecting his family starts to overwhelm Blake. The tension grows knowing his attempts at communication have been in vain, and he asks for a moment to think, but he doesn't find any peace. Instead of resting, he spends hours reinforcing the entrances while Charlotte tries to sleep and calm herself. The wound on his arm complicates his work and soon he starts feeling off. Sweat soaks through his clothes, and as he tries to wipe it off, a strange sound stops him, creaks that sound like footsteps on a wooden floor. Following the noise, Blake locates it upstairs. Summoning his courage, he heads down into the dark basement. There, he discovers a huge spider that seems to disorient him. For a moment, we see him stagger, but he quickly regains control, though something about him feels different. Now with a changed demeanor, he returns to the living room where everything feels unusually strange. He finds his wife and asks her to be quiet. Blake insists that the beast is hunting them, and from the window he spots it wandering around the house. Our protagonist starts acting strangely, convinced he can smell things beyond the door, but suddenly the monster bursts through, tearing through the thin wooden board in an attempt to grab his foot. Charlotte, armed with a hammer, manages to save him, though his leg is severely injured. Later, Blake wakes up on the couch, his leg throbbing in pain, and realizes it's almost 2 in the morning. With effort, he sits up and exits the living room. He doesn't have to wait long before hearing the strange noise again, like a bizarre growl. Heading back down to the basement to investigate, we realize Blake isn't hearing real growls. He's hearing his wife's voice distorted into grotesque, unnatural sounds. Meanwhile, Charlotte desperately tries to get help over the radio. She speaks with urgency and fear, explaining that her husband is seriously ill. She tells them they were attacked by an unknown creature, and she fears Blake has been infected. Not sure if anyone's even listening, she pleads tirelessly for help, confessing that her husband doesn't seem aware of his own deterioration, and she's at a loss for what to do. Suddenly, Charlotte feels a presence in the room. She turns around and finds Blake hidden in the shadows, mumbling incomprehensibly. Slowly, his face begins to change. The human features disappear, replaced by something strange and terrifying. Charlotte, deeply concerned, speaks to him softly, reminding him how much she loves him and assuring him that everything will be okay. But when Blake loses control and soils his pants, she decides to take him to bed so he can rest. Blake's deterioration keeps advancing. His hair begins to fall out, his face loses its human features, and his ability to speak fades completely. Charlotte, trying to communicate with him, hands him a notebook and a marker so he can express what he's feeling. Blake writes with great difficulty that he's dying. She, trying to stay calm, responds that he's just sick, that it's something temporary, and that he won't even notice when he finally gets better. Filled with love and desperation, Charlotte reassures him that everything will be okay because their daughter and she need him. She confesses that she can't imagine a life without him, her partner, and her best friend. However, from Blake's perspective, the world starts to change. The colors turn strange, and his wife's words stop making sense. When he tries to tell her he can't understand her anymore, Charlotte responds with the exact same words. In an attempt to stay calm, Charlotte tells her daughter that everything will be fine, that they just have to wait until dawn to take him to the doctor. Meanwhile, Blake gets up from the couch, but all that comes out of him are faint growls. Charlotte, alarmed, notices that the wound on her husband's arm looks horrifyingly bad. As she completely removes the bandage, Blake panics and heads to a corner where he starts scratching frantically to relieve the itch. At that moment, another one of his molars falls to the ground and his gaze seems vacant, revealing a terrifying emptiness that shows the human part of him is quickly disappearing. The man leaves the room with a look full of sadness and pain, a suffering that Charlotte cannot understand. In response, she decides to step away toward the window, where she notices a truck parked nearby. Without hesitation, she heads to the basement in search of what looks like the keys to the vehicle, also grabbing a battery and a knife to protect herself if necessary. Thus, our protagonist leads her family in a quiet escape. They rush to the truck, and Charlotte manages to get her husband into the back seat, while their daughter settles in the vehicle as well. With everything ready, the responsibility of starting the engine falls on her. However, the atmosphere inside the truck turns tense. Ginger, terrified, avoids looking directly at her father, who has started to transform completely. Meanwhile, Charlotte hurries to start the truck, but her initial attempts are noisy and unsuccessful. Amidst the chaos, Blake has already changed irrevocably. Suddenly, a spark of hope lights up Charlotte's face. She finally manages to get the vehicle started. Quickly, she disconnects the extra wiring to make sure the engine runs smoothly, but when she tries to clean the windshield, she faces a terrifying sight. A horrific figure stands in front of the truck, a grotesque being that violently breaks the glass and rips the gear shift out. Family, gripped by panic, flees to a nearby greenhouse, dragging Blake with them, who barely retains any trace of his former identity. However, they seek refuge on a fragile surface that starts to give way under Ginger's weight. Meanwhile, the werewolf lurks beneath the greenhouse, and with its claws it begins to tear at the structure from below, trying to reach them. Desperate, Ginger tries to move closer to her parents to avoid falling, but the tarp holding her up partially tears, leaving half of her body exposed to the beast. Just as it's about to grab her, an unexpected act interrupts it. Filled with courage, Blake tells Charlotte and their daughter to head back to the house. Though the idea doesn't sit well with her, Charlotte agrees. In a final act of humanity, Blake leaps from the greenhouse and runs toward the woods, managing to distract the creature. Both, consumed by desperation, race back to the house while they hear the fierce growls and the sound of claws scraping through the trees. When they reach the house, they manage to lock themselves in, but the tension inside quickly boils over. Ginger accuses her mother of abandoning her father, blaming her for what might be his death. Charlotte, however, tries to explain that it was all to protect her, that both of them risked their lives for her. Suddenly, the growls outside stop, catching Charlotte's attention. Looking through the window, she sees Blake outside. Although his appearance is completely different, moved by her daughter's pleas, she decides to open the door. Blake, now unrecognizable, stumbles into the room, moving awkwardly with ragged breathing. Ginger, convinced it's still her father, tries to approach him, ignoring the threatening signals his presence gives off. Charlotte, in a state of contained panic, watches, fully aware that the line between humanity and monstrosity has completely vanished in Blake. In the end, he succumbs to the closeness of his little daughter, who with tenderness places her hand on his forehead and, as if playing one of their innocent games, asks him what he's thinking. Even though the child reminds him of how much she loves him and shows clear concern, Blake can only hear incoherent mumbling from his little one. Suddenly, what was once Blake starts to writhe in pain on the floor. His claws, now more like nightmares than human limbs, lose their nails as he vomits a thick, reddish substance mixed with clots and disgusting remnants. Amid the mess, he manages to spot a human finger. Charlotte tries to move closer to her daughter to protect her, but Blake stops her, trapping her in the kitchen and forcing her to face the monster he's become. However, in a fleeting moment of clarity, Blake makes a desperate decision to step away to protect them. But as soon as he opens the door to leave, the first werewolf, who seemed to have disappeared, attacks him with fury, delivering a brutal beating. The two werewolves engage in a fierce fight, their growls tearing through the air like a terrifying echo. Charlotte, gripped by fear and instinct, grabs a knife and tries to attack the other creature while looking for a chance to escape with Ginger. But the monster, far from giving up, becomes even more terrifying. It keeps fighting even after losing its fingers. When it looks ready to chase them, Blake steps in once again, facing the intruder to save his family. However, the battle doesn't last long. Our protagonist, wounded and exhausted, loses ground. Charlotte, determined to help him, prepares to step in, but she watches in horror as the first werewolf drags Blake outside. At that moment, Ginger, from a nearby closet, desperately calls out to her father, drawing the beast's attention. Charlotte reacts quickly, stopping her daughter from getting hurt. Just then, Blake returns with unexpected strength and finishes off his opponent by biting into its throat viciously. As the other monster falls, Blake notices a distinctive tattoo on his opponent's arm. In his disbelief, he doesn't realize that the creature he's fought to protect his wife and daughter wasn't anyone else but his own father. Aware of his irreversible transformation, Blake decides to leave the house as quickly as possible. Charlotte, broken with pain, watches as he walks away toward the outside, where his metamorphosis continues. He writhes on the ground, his body being shaped by indescribable pain. His chest seems to change from within, nails shedding to make way for long claws, and his jaw and cheekbones transform, adapting to an environment he now perceives as his own. Inside the house, Ginger, confused and sad, asks her mother why her father got infected like that. Charlotte, with a lump in her throat, explains that Blake's father had disappeared in the woods a long time ago, and everyone thought he was dead, but that wasn't the case. He contracted the same strange disease, which he eventually passed on to his son. The little girl, tears in her eyes, expresses how much she wishes her father could be the same as before. Charlotte, trying to comfort her, leans toward her and assures her that she shares that wish with all her heart. She promises to always be there to take care of her, but suddenly the house lights go out, plunging them into an overwhelming darkness. Our protagonist looks out the window and sees what was once her husband, now transformed into a horrific monster with prominent fangs. His empty eyes reflect no recognition, and as she quickly pulls away from the window, Charlotte feels a chill run down her spine. The certainty that both she and her daughter are being hunted by this new and terrifying creature settles in her mind. Determined to protect them, she grabs a knife while trying to reassure her daughter, telling her that everything will be okay. With slow, cautious steps, she heads toward the stairs, but as she turns to check on Ginger, her heart stops when she sees Blake right behind her. The image of the werewolf, grotesque and threatening, shocks her so much that, in a desperate act of bravery, she tightens her grip on the knife, ready to defend herself and her little one. Blake, consumed by his instincts, moves closer with clear intentions to devour them. His wife, with a movement full of determination, manages to wound him with the weapon, but the monster, far from backing off, grabs the knife with his bare hands, indifferent to the pain as the blade rips through his flesh. The scene is pure terror, but Charlotte and Ginger, driven by fear and the instinct to survive, manage to escape the house and take refuge in a dark shed. Inside, Charlotte finds an iron chain which she quickly grabs as an improvised weapon. Holding onto it tightly, she braces for what seems like an inevitable confrontation. As the monster has already reached the doors of their refuge, the creature pushes and pounds with unnatural strength, trying to get under the doors. Finally, the threatening sounds stop, and Charlotte thinks for a moment that the danger has passed. However, in the shadows, the werewolf has managed to sneak in without either of them noticing. The monster takes another step toward them, but falls into the bear trap Charlotte had set set. The tension eases for a moment when she lights the lantern in her hands, revealing Blake's grotesque figure, now trapped. Seizing the opportunity, mother and daughter flee the shed, leaving the monster behind, but the beast isn't willing to give up on its prey. In an act of brutality, it tears off the trapped leg with its own teeth, freeing itself from the trap at the cost of unimaginable sacrifice. Now the werewolf crawls out of the barn, and despite its wound, it charges into the forest in search of its victims. Charlotte and Ginger run without looking back, pushing through the dense terrain of bushes and trees. The monster's roar, deep and terrifying, echoes in the air, pushing them to move faster. In the middle of nowhere, Charlotte stumbles upon mutilated limbs and belongings scattered near the truck they arrived in. Quickly, Charlotte hands the lantern to her daughter and starts looking for a solution, but as she looks up at the truck, both of them see the werewolf perched on the vehicle, staring at them. With no other choice, they resume their flight. Finally, the darkness of the night begins to fade with the first light of dawn. Mother and daughter find shelter in an old hunting spot, a place heavy with grim memories. It was here, years ago, that Blake hid with his father while they were hunting, stalked by a creature much like the one he's become now. But unlike the old werewolf, he decides to peek out, only to stop when he sees Ginger, visibly terrified. His daughter, with a heart-wrenching intuition, senses that her father wants it all to end. But just at that moment, the fierce werewolf lunges to attack, only to be stopped by a shot fired by his wife. In the end, our protagonists manage to save themselves, but not without losing Blake in the process. As the beast takes its final breath, Charlotte understands she's lost both her husband and her best friend. With this painful realization, both women leave the forest behind, crossing the valley that he had always wanted to show them.